The world you see when you open your eyes in the morning isn't exactly what you think it is. There's an apparent solidity to the walls, a continuity in time, and a logic to the events that surround us. But if you observe closely enough, with the kind of attention we usually reserve for moments of shock or near-death experiences, you'll realize that reality has a strange texture. It feels like a radio transmission that, for a millisecond, loses its tuning. You felt it before. It's that moment when an object seems out of place, or when a conversation sounds like it's been recorded and played back on an endless loop. There's something fundamentally wrong with how you perceive the world. Most people spend their entire lives operating in what we might call automatic mode. They wake up, consume, react, and sleep, believing wholeheartedly that the layer of events they experience is ultimate reality. However, Philip Dick realized too early that what we call reality is in fact a fragile construct, a stage set that can be removed at any moment to reveal the scaffolding and darkness behind it. Observe your daily behavior. When you drive to work, you often arrive at your destination without remembering a single kilometer of the journey. Where were you while your body was operating the machine? Who was in control? This automatism is not just a biological habit, it is evidence of failure. Your consciousness is so accustomed to processing false reality that it disconnects, letting a biological computer program run in its place. As Philip Dick already warned, reality is something that, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. The problem is that we have been trained to believe in things that are purely synthetic. We are immersed in a manipulated perception system where consciousness is not the driver, but a passenger on a train running on invisible tracks. Dick sensed that something was wrong precisely because he saw these gaps. He noticed that memory can be implanted, that emotions can be manufactured by external stimuli, and that the very notion of self is the most unstable component of the entire simulation. Consider the silence. Not the silence of the absence of sound, but the silence that occurs when the narrative of your life pauses. In those seconds of emptiness, an unease arises. It is the internal recognition that the structure of your world is held together by invisible threads of information and expectation. If you remove the expectation of what tomorrow should be, what remains of today? What remains is a succession of data that your mind desperately tries to organize to make sense of. But sense is an illusion of comfort. Reality is not obligated to make sense to you. It simply exists as a constant flow of manipulated perceptions that you accept as true because the alternative, the recognition of falsehood, is too disturbing to bear. Often, the revelation of the flaw does not come through a major catastrophic event, but through small details that the conscious mind tends to discard to maintain sanity. It is the light that falls in a way that seems too artificial on a tree in the park. It is the face of a stranger in the crowd that seems to have been copied and pasted from a memory from 10 years ago. It's the feeling that time isn't moving forward, but merely folding back on itself. Dick realized that reality is a control system, and the most effective control is the one that convinces the prisoner that he is free. You believe that your choices are your own, that your thoughts are original, and that your perception is a faithful mirror of the external world. However, the mirror is cracked, and the image it reflects is a simplified and edited version of what is really happening. I invite you to observe your own mind right now. As you listen to or read these words, there is a part of you that is judging, another that is trying to anticipate what will come next, and another that is simply processing the electrical signals. Which one are you? What if I told you that none of them are? That you are just the flaw in the system trying to understand the system? Consciousness under control does not perceive itself as controlled. It perceives itself as functional. But functionality is the greatest sign that you are integrated into the simulation. When everything works perfectly, you don't question it. Only when the engine sputters do you remember that there is an engine. Dick sensed that the shock of reality was the only chance we had to glimpse the truth. Manipulated perception works through fear and desire, the two major axes that keep the mind in a state of constant reactivity. If you are always reacting to what happens outside of you, you will never have time to observe what is happening inside. The false reality system feeds you constant information incessant noise, and manufactured crises to ensure that your attention never turns to the observer. If your perception is always occupied with the scenery, it will never notice the projector. And the projector is inside you, fueled by layers of cultural, biological, and technological programming that you never authorized, but which you accept as your nature. There is something deeply unsettling about realizing that your identity is, to a large extent, a construct of external data. The music you like, the opinions you hold, the clothes you choose. How much of this is a genuine expression of an autonomous being, and how much is merely the result of social and biological algorithms that have shaped your perception since birth? Dick realized too early that the human being is a plastic entity, easily molded by invisible pressures that define what is real and what is imaginary. He saw that the boundary between man and machine, between the authentic and the simulated, was disappearing. And today, that boundary is almost non-existent. This initial realization is only the beginning of the shift. This is not a conspiracy theory or a science fiction fantasy. It is a clinical observation of the automatic functioning of consciousness. You are living in a narrative you didn't write, playing a role you didn't choose, in a world that disintegrates the moment you stop paying attention to it. The structural flaw is already visible to those who dare to look at the edges of their peripheral vision. The world is not what it seems, and what's worse, neither are you. The false reality is not a system error, it is the system. And as Dick already warned, the flaw is not out there in the stars or in governments, but in the way your brain decodes chaos into order. You are surrounded by an architecture of illusion that is so vast that it becomes invisible. But if you allow the estrangement to grow, if you stop fighting the feeling that something is wrong, you will begin to see the cracks. And once you see the crack in the wall of reality, you will never be able to look at the wall in the same way again. The comfort of ignorance is a door that, once closed, never opens again, and you've just put your hand on the doorknob. Have you ever had the feeling that the world around you is too small? Not in a geographical sense, but in the depth of the interactions and scenarios that make up your day. Sometimes, walking down a street you've known for years, a flash of strangeness arises, as if the building facades were just painted plywood sheets. And if you ran fast enough and turned the corner ahead of schedule, you would find emptiness or the workers of reality still assembling the scene. This discomfort is not a symptom of tiredness. It's your anomaly detection system trying to warn you that the continuity of your life is maintained by a very thin processing thread. There's something wrong with how you perceive the world, and this error becomes more evident when you stop looking at what the system wants you to see and start looking at the edges. Consider the phenomenon we call coincidence. You think of someone you haven't seen in a decade, and minutes later you receive a message from that person or run into them at the market. The world tries to convince you that this is just chance operating in a vast universe. However, Philip Dick sensed that something was wrong with this simplistic explanation. For him, these synchronicities were not random events, but glitches in the rendering of the temporal flow, as if the system, to save energy, were reusing information assets. Dick realized too early that our reality operates with an economy of resources. Why create a completely new event when you can recycle a memory or a pattern that is already active in your mind? When you perceive a coincidence, you are not seeing destiny. You are seeing the simulation code repeating itself because it didn't expect you to be paying attention to that specific detail. Think about the objects in your house. You know where you left your keys. You have the tactile memory of placing them on the table, but when you go to get them, they're not there. You search every corner, return to the same place 3 times, and on the 4th attempt, inexplicably, the keys are exactly where you knew they were. The logical explanation is that you got distracted, that your mind failed you. But what if the failure wasn't yours? What if, for a brief instant, that object had been removed from the plane of perception and then reinserted? Dick realized that matter is not as solid as our senses suggest. He saw reality as a projection of information, and information can suffer glitches. These small losses of continuity in everyday life are subtle warnings that the solidity of the world is an illusion maintained by a consciousness that has been programmed to ignore the impossible. Observe the people around you on public transport or in a shopping mall. They seem to be following predefined scripts. The dialogues you overhear are repetitive, the reactions are predictable, and the faces seem to follow a limited design pattern. Sometimes you encounter someone who seems all too familiar, even though you've never seen them before. It's the feeling that human diversity is, in fact, a variation on a limited number of basic models. Philip Dick intuited that something was wrong with the very notion of individuality. He suggested that many of those who cross our path may be what he called simulacra, entities that exist only to fill the scene and maintain the illusion of a populated and vibrant world. When you feel isolated in the middle of a crowd, it may not be due to a lack of social connection, but to the unconscious recognition that there is no one really there besides you and the system. Your own memory is the most fertile ground for manipulating perception. You trust your memories as if they were video recordings of past events, but science has already proven that memory is reconstructive. Every time you remember something, you are creating a new version of that fact. If the basis of your identity is the past, and your past is a fluid construct that changes with each reflection, who are you now? Dick realized too early that memories can be implanted with terrifying ease. As Philip Dick already warned, what defines a human being is not what they remember, but the nature of their response to the present. However, if your present is an automatic reaction to manufactured stimuli, you are operating like a clockwork mechanism. You wake up to the sound of an alarm, consume news that shapes your mood, work on tasks that feed a system you don't understand, and return home to consume entertainment that reinforces the false reality. Where, in this entire cycle, is there an act of pure will? The automatic nature of consciousness is the greatest evidence that we live in a control system. If you can spend hours of your day without a single conscious reflection on the nature of your existence, you are integrated. The system doesn't need chains if it can ensure your mind never goes off track. Dick sensed something was wrong when he realized time didn't seem to flow linearly. He spoke of vertical time, where all events occur simultaneously, but our limited perception organizes them into a horizontal line so we can process them without going crazy. But this organization is an edit. What you call today is just the page the system has decided to show you now. If you could see the previous and subsequent pages at the same time, the illusion of progress and personal history would crumble. The rhythmic disruption of your perception can occur at any moment. It could be a sound in the dead of night with no apparent source, or the feeling that your reflection in the mirror took a millisecond longer to move. These moments of suspension are direct invitations to self-observation of your own mind. What happens to your fear when you can't explain what you saw? What happens to your security when the ground beneath your feet seems, for a second, to be made of light and frequency instead of ceramic and cement? False reality depends on your passive acceptance. It needs you to keep telling yourself, it was just an impression, I'm tired, this is impossible. But impossibility is just a category defined by the system to protect its functional integrity. Consider the existential weariness that seems to permeate modern society. It's not a physical weariness that sleep can cure. It's an exhaustion of the soul that comes from playing the same role in a scenario that is beginning to wear thin. You feel like you're waiting for something that never arrives, or that you're searching for a door that has been removed from the wall. Philip Dick realized that this world is, in a way, a black iron prison, an invisible structure that keeps us confined within a limited perception of our true nature. The prison has no visible bars. It's made of concepts, social obligations, manufactured fears, and the unwavering belief that this world is the only possible one. However, the very fact that you feel this discomfort is proof that you don't fully belong here. As Philip Dick warned, reality is a system that tries to close in on itself, eliminating any trace of an outside. But the system is imperfect. It leaves traces. It leaves residues of information that don't make sense in the logic of everyday life. If you start collecting these residues, the impossible coincidences, the lapses in collective memory, the feeling that time is speeding up or stopping, you will begin to assemble the map of your own way out. But be careful. The system doesn't like to be mapped. When you start observing the flaw starts observing you back. The light that now seems artificial in your room, the almost inaudible hum of electrical appliances, the vacant stares of people on the street. All of this begins to converge on a single, inevitable realization. You are not merely observing a false reality, you are an integral part of it that has begun to awaken. And an awakening component is a threat to the integrity of the entire structure. The automatism is being broken, the frequency of your consciousness is shifting, and as you try to cling to the remaining certainties, you realize that the walls of the room seem a little less solid than they did 10 minutes ago. The scene is trembling, the curtain is about to be pulled back, and what lies behind it is not something that can be explained with the words you learned in this simulation. The strangeness is no longer an occasional visitor, it is now your only reliable guide. If you've accepted the idea that the external world might be a construct, now we need to look at what's processing that construct, your mind. There's a dangerous assumption that even if everything out there is false, the observer inside is real. But what if the observer is just the most sophisticated piece of the whole machine? Stop for a second and try to locate the I. Not your name, not your story, but the exact point where thoughts arise. You'll notice that thoughts aren't fabricated by you. They simply appear. They float in your consciousness like debris in a river, and you, out of habit, cling to them and say, "This is mine." There's something wrong with how you perceive your own mind. Consider the nature of internal dialogue. That voice that never stops, that comments on every action, criticizes every mistake, and plans every future step. If you are the one listening to the voice, who is speaking? And why does this voice seem to follow patterns you didn't choose? Philip Dick realized too early that the human mind is a receiver, not a transmitter. Dick intuited that something was wrong with our mental autonomy, suggesting that what we call personality is in fact a set of programmed guidelines to keep us operational within the black iron prison. If your mind were truly yours, you would have control over your next thought. But you don't. You are the spectator of a film that you believe you are directing. Have you ever had the feeling of merely observing your body act, as if you were one step behind your own skin? It's as if there's a millimetric delay between your will and the action, a space where doubt whispers that you are just a passenger. At what point in your life did you feel most intensely that you were not the author of your own reactions? Record this experience, because these failures of identification are the moments when the simulation of the self loses its breath. Memory, as we've already discussed, is unstable, but emotion is what truly anchors us in the false reality. The system uses pain, pleasure, and anxiety as electrical signals to ensure you remain focused on the scenario. When you feel fear, your perception narrows. The world becomes urgent, solid, and indisputable. It's the perfect defense mechanism. As Philip Dick already warned, absolute control isn't exercised through armed guards, but through managing what the individual feels is necessary. If you intensely desire something or desperately fear losing something, you are completely under the control of the structure. Emotion is the fuel that keeps the projection functioning. Dick sensed something was wrong when he observed that people reacted to artificial stimuli with the same intensity as they reacted to real life. Today, this is our norm. We cry over pixelated characters, feel anger at text on screens, and seek validation in binary numbers. Our perception has been outsourced. What happens to your consciousness when you remove all external stimuli? The void that emerges is not your true self. It's merely the space where the programming used to run. The absence of noise reveals that there is no solid essence behind the social mask, but rather a crack, an opening through which true reality could enter if we weren't so afraid of it. Observe the phenomenon of recognition. You see a pattern in the cloud, a face in the texture of the wall, or an intention in a random event. Your mind is a machine for seeking order in chaos, but this order is an overlay. We don't see what things are. We see what our minds have been trained to project onto them. Philip Dick realized that if we change the frequency of reception, the world changes shape. He saw reality as unfolding information, and we are the decoders. If the decoder is manipulated, the received message will be a consistent lie. You trust your senses because you believe they are windows, but they are in fact filters. The automatism of the mind extends to our morality and our values. Do you believe what you believe because of a sincere search for truth, or because these ideas were implanted through years of repetition and social pressure? Dick realized too early that ideas are like viruses. They seek hosts to reproduce and spread. Many of your deepest convictions may simply be third-party code running in your internal processor. There's a subtle warning here. There's something wrong with how you define yourself. Your identity is a database you don't manage, populated by sources you don't know. Consider the experience of déjà vu from this new perspective. The system tries to explain it as a neural processing error, a delay between the brain hemispheres. But what if it's something more literal? What if it's the recognition that the scenario has already been used before? As Philip Dick warned, time is not a road we travel, but a landscape that is already all there. When you feel you have already lived a moment, perhaps you have only accessed data that should be hidden. The feeling of repetition is the crack in the linearity of the simulation. Time is the tool the system uses to prevent us from seeing the totality all at once. If you stop fighting to keep your identity cohesive for just 5 minutes, what happens? The anxiety that arises is the security system trying to reconnect you to the data matrix. The fear of being nothing is what keeps us being something we didn't choose. Dick sensed that something was wrong because he saw that human suffering stemmed from this fixation on a non-existent self. By observing your own mind, you begin to notice that thoughts are automatic, emotions are reactive, and memories are edited. What remains of you when everything synthetic is removed? The false reality is not merely external, it is an architecture that inhabits your frontal lobes. It shapes your dreams, defines your boundaries, and dictates the rhythm of your breathing. When Dick realized that reality was a control system, he understood that escape was not a displacement in space, but a displacement in perception. You don't escape the simulation by leaving the world. You escape by ceasing to be the processor of the lie. But how do you stop being what you've always believed yourself to be? This is the breaking point. This is where the tension between what you think you are and what you actually observe becomes unbearable. The rhythmic disruption of this process occurs when you stop responding to stimuli, when the world screams for your attention and you stare into silence, when your mind suggests a worry and you observe it as if it were a television commercial playing in an empty room. Philip Dick realized too early that civil disobedience begins with perceptual disobedience. If you don't accept the data, the system cannot shape your existence, but the price of this freedom is the loss of comfort. Do you prefer a lie that makes sense or a truth that leaves you without solid ground? The rift in your consciousness is widening. The invitation to self-observation is no longer a philosophical suggestion, it's a survival necessity. You're beginning to notice that your mind is a labyrinth designed so that you never reach the center. And at the center of the labyrinth, there is no monster, no treasure. There is only the void from which everything arises. Dick sensed that something was wrong because the system expends monumental energy keeping us away from this void. What is there that they don't want you to see? Perhaps the discovery that you were never really here, at least not in the way they told you. If your mind is a receiver and the world is a projection, we need to understand the anomalies that the system cannot hide. There are events that defy probabilistic logic in such a way that the only rational explanation is a flaw in the programming of reality. You've probably heard of accounts where entire cities seem to have shifted places in the collective memory, or of people waking up in lives they don't recognize, despite all the surrounding documents proving otherwise. Philip Dick realized too early that these accounts are not mere hallucinations. They are what he called leaks from adjacent universes. Dick intuited that something was wrong with our notion of a single timeline. For him, reality is a patchwork of possibilities that the system tries to keep isolated, but which occasionally overlap. Consider the statistical data that defies common sense. There are moments in history where a succession of improbable coincidences saved or destroyed civilizations, as if an invisible screenwriter had decided to change the course of the plot at the last second. On an individual level, this manifests as a stroke of luck or an inexplicable tragedy. But if you observe the pattern, you will see that the system has a preference for maintaining balance. It doesn't want you to win too much, nor to lose everything to the point of stopping playing. It wants you in the center, in automatism. Philip Dick already warned that reality is a homeostatic mechanism. It adjusts to neutralize any perception that threatens the stability of the illusion. When something very improbable happens to you, it's not a miracle. It's a course correction by the system trying to keep you occupied with the scenario. Imagine you're walking through a forest and you find an isolated door with no walls around it. Your first reaction is to laugh at the bizarreness. But if you open the door and find your own room on the other side, your brain will collapse. Why does this seem impossible? Because the system has trained your perception to accept spatial continuity. However, at subatomic levels, continuity doesn't exist. What we call matter is 99% empty space filled with frequencies. If the frequency changes, the wall ceases to be a wall. Dick realized that solidity is merely an agreement between your consciousness and the simulation code. There's something wrong with how you trust the ground beneath your feet. The ground is only there because you expect it to be. There are documented reports of out-of-place objects, technological artifacts found in geological layers millions of years old. The system attempts to explain this as fraud or dating errors, but the persistence of this data suggests something deeper. Perhaps time is not an arrow, but a loop. Perhaps we are living through the same eras repeatedly, and the artifacts are remnants of previous versions of the simulation that were not fully cleaned up. Philip Dick sensed that something was wrong with human progress. He saw history as a scratched record that always returns to the same point of conflict and control. If you look at today's news and compare it to texts from 2,000 years ago, you will realize that the anxieties, desires, and power structures are identical. We change the tools, but the prison code remains the same. Consider the phenomenon of people vanishing into thin air. Thousands of individuals disappear every year without leaving a single trace in circumstances where escape or crime are impossible. In some of these accounts, people return years later, having aged no more than a day, claiming they simply turned a corner and found themselves in a place where the sun didn't move. To the system, these people are crazy. To Philip Dick, they are travelers who fell through the cracks in the scenery. Dick realized too early that false reality has perceptual wormholes. If your consciousness isn't vibrating at the correct frequency for a millisecond, you can simply slip off the map. And what exists off the map is what the system most fears you discovering. The automatic nature of our perception prevents us from seeing these holes. We are so focused on paying bills, keeping up appearances, and following the script that we ignore when the room light flickers in a code we don't recognize. Have you ever felt that your pet was looking at something behind you that you couldn't see? Animals don't have the denial filter that humans have developed. They see the raw structure. They see the monitors. Dick realized that our sanity is the price we pay to be integrated. To see the flaw, you need to be willing to appear crazy to the other components of the system. The subtle warning here is, your normality is your shackle. Consider the complexity of your DNA. Billions of lines of code dictating every detail of your biological functioning. Where is the programmer? If there is code, there is language. If there is language, there is intention. Philip Dick already warned that our biology is the hardware interface of the simulation. We were written to process reality in this specific way. If we could edit the code, we could see through walls, hear the thoughts of the stars, and stop time. But the DNA security system is rigorous. It keeps us confined to the human scale, to limited vision, and to inevitable death. Death from this perspective is merely the end of the license to use your current hardware. The improbable events you ignore are the only real clues you have. That number that repeats itself everywhere, the phrase from a book that perfectly answers your secret thought, the dream that manifests in physical reality the next day. Philip Dick sensed that something was wrong with our definition of coincidence. For him, the universe is a hologram where each part contains the whole. If you change information at one point, the entire hologram adjusts. Synchronicities are the moments when you touch the fabric of reality and it vibrates back. You are not a passive observer. You are a participant in a conversation who has forgotten how to speak. Total immersion in the narrative of your life is what prevents the revelation. As long as you care about the outcome of the game, you will be trapped in it. But the moment you become indifferent to the manufactured victories and defeats, the texture of the falsehood begins to reveal itself. You begin to see the repetitions, the cliches of the simulation, the limits of the processing. The world seems less like a vast place and more like a closed room with strategically positioned mirrors. Dick realized too early that infinity is an optical illusion created so that we never try to touch the wall. what happens if you decide not to follow the next automatic impulse? If instead of reacting angrily to an insult, you simply observe the anger as processed data? If instead of seeking comfort in consumption, you observe the emptiness of desire? Philip Dick intuited that freedom lies not in changing the circumstances of the world, but in changing the nature of your response. The system can control the scenario, but it has difficulty controlling a component that has stopped reacting. The rhythmic disruption of your consciousness is your only weapon, and the improbable is your only map. We are reaching a point of no return. Improbable reports are increasing. Collective perception is beginning to fail. The system is overwhelmed, trying to maintain the illusion for 8 billion simultaneous processors. The failures are becoming macroscopic. You see them in the sky, on the networks, in people's eyes. Philip Dick already warned that the end of the world is not an explosion, but the moment when the lie becomes unsustainable. And when the lie falls, what remains is not nothingness, but what has always been there, waiting for you to stop looking at the colored lights of the simulation. The tension now reaches its peak because we are no longer talking just about perception, but about will. If everything around you is a construct and your own mind operates in automatic mode, what remains of your freedom? Philip Dick realized that most of our decisions are not our own. They are the result of force vectors, biology, culture, trauma, and necessity. Dick intuited that something was wrong with the idea of free will, suggesting that we are like characters in a book who believe they are inventing their own lines, while the author has already written the final period. The feeling of choice is the lubricant that makes the simulation's gears run without friction. If you knew you had no choice, you would stop acting, and the system needs you to act. Observe the moment when you decide to buy something, say something, or feel something. If you trace the origin of that decision, you will find a labyrinth of external influences that culminated in that impulse. See, where were you in that process? Philip Dick already warned that we are information processing machines that believe themselves to be gods. Our arrogance is our greatest blindness. We believe we control fire, when in reality fire is merely a constant of the system we have been allowed to use. We believe we created technology, when technology is merely the physical manifestation of the code that already inhabits our mental structure. There is something profoundly disturbing in recognizing that your will is a byproduct of the architecture of falsehood. Have you ever felt that, no matter how hard you try to change your life, you always end up returning to the same patterns of behavior and feeling? As if there were an elastic force pulling you back to a specific version of yourself that the system considers stable? When was the last time you felt that one of your decisions was truly original, free from any fear, desire, or habit? Share that moment if it exists, because understanding the rarity of pure will is the first step to collapsing the sense of imprisonment. The collapse of meaning occurs when the narrative ceases to convince. It's like watching a movie for the 10th time and starting to notice continuity errors, the actor's poorly done makeup, and the fact that the set walls shake when someone slams the door. The false reality depends on your emotional investment. The moment you become a cold observer, the magic disappears. Philip Dick realized too early that desperation is a maintenance tool. As long as you are desperate to be happy, to be loved, or to succeed, you are validating the parameters of the simulation. But what if you simply stop? What if you accept the absurdity of existence without trying to fix it? The subtle warning Philip Dick left us is that the system will react to your apathy. It will send new crises, new temptations, new forms of pain to force you to engage again. The manipulated perception system is aggressive. It does not tolerate emptiness. It prefers that you suffer rather than feel nothing, because suffering is a form of attention, and attention is what fuels projection. Dick sensed that something was wrong because he saw that the world seemed to become noisier every time he tried to find inner silence. Noise is the Matrix's defense. Consider the nature of time now that tension is rising. Do you feel that time is speeding up? That months pass like weeks, and that you never have space to process what has happened? This is not just an effect of age or technology. It is the system shortening processing cycles to prevent consciousness from dwelling on compromising details. If you don't have time to reflect, You don't have time to perceive the flaw. Philip Dick already warned that time is a form of mind control. It keeps us chasing a future that never arrives, while distracting us from a present that is, in fact, an eternal repetition of the same corrupted data. The meaning of life, as we are taught, is a carrot dangling in front of a donkey. Work, reproduce, contribute to society, be remembered. But why? To feed the continuity of a system that doesn't care about you. Dick realized that true meaning cannot be found within the categories of simulation. Any goal the system offers you is a trap. The true goal is the collapse of the fabricated meaning. It is the deconstruction of all the layers of importance that have been placed upon you. When nothing else matters in the logic of the false, you finally become free to see what is truly important in the logic of the true. Philip Dick sensed that something was wrong with our search for purpose. He suggested that purpose is how the system gives us a functional identity. I am a doctor. I am a father. I am a citizen. But these are just labels stuck to the hardware. If you remove the labels, what's left? The system is terrified of that question. It wants you to identify with the label until the end. It wants you to defend your prison tooth and nail. But the tension is mounting. You feel the pressure in your chest, the restlessness in your mind, the sensation that the world is about to tear apart. The rhythmic break in this moment is the recognition that you don't need meaning to exist. Existence precedes meaning. Meaning is an afterthought, a footnote. Dick realized too early that enlightenment is not about finding the meaning of life, but about losing the illusion that life needs a meaning defined by the system. It's the moment when you look at the false reality and laugh, not with joy, but with recognition. You see the trick, you see the invisible thread, you see the illusionist's hand. And now, the twist. If you are part of the simulation and you begin to awaken, what happens to the simulation? Philip Dick suggested that reality is a fragmented collective consciousness. If enough fragments begin to see the flaw, the entire structure begins to disintegrate. The collapse of your personal sense is a direct attack on the integrity of the false world. You are not just a victim, you are a potential awakening virus, and the system knows this. That's why the pressure increases. That's why the discomfort becomes almost unbearable. You are being tested. The system wants to know if you will break down or if you will awaken. The silence that follows this realization is charged with electricity. There is no comfort here, only the stark realization that the will you believed you had was an illusion, and that true will only begins when you stop obeying the impulses of simulation. Dick realized that the way out is the way in, but not to the self you know. It's to the void that observes the self. The tension will not lessen. Reality will not return to normal, because normal was the lie, and the lie can no longer bear the weight of your observation. We have reached the point of no return. If you have followed this shift this far, your perception is no longer the same. You can no longer look at a crowd, a screen, or your own reflection without seeing the shadow of the invisible structure. This is closure, but not in the sense of a conclusion that brings peace. It is the closure of a cycle of ignorance. Philip Dick realized too early that truth is not a destination we reach, but a condition that strikes us when all lies lose their power. Dick sensed that something was wrong with the idea that we would be saved by something external. The only possible salvation is the awakening of the inner observer, that part of you that is unaffected by the scenario, that has no name, and that cannot be programmed. The practical application of everything we've discussed lies not in complex theories, but in constant observation. From now on, your exercise is perceptual disobedience. When you feel an automatic impulse of fear, stop. Observe the mechanics of fear in your body as if it were a meteorological phenomenon on a distant planet. When the world tries to sell you an urgent desire, observe the architecture of temptation. Philip Dick already warned that the system's greatest victory is making you believe that your reaction is the only possible one. By creating a space between stimulus and response, you create a crack in the simulation. It is in this crack that your true essence breathes. Consider your daily life as a laboratory for awakening. The automatism of consciousness is combated with radical presence. Be present when you wash your hands, when you walk to the car, when you listen to someone speak. Don't let the system process these moments for you. Reclaim your perception. Dick realized that false reality is maintained by our absence. If we are mentally elsewhere, the system can run any script. But if you are here now with sharp and silent attention, the projection begins to lose clarity. The observer is the poison of illusion. The personal transformation this knowledge brings about is not comfortable. You will lose your taste for many things that once seemed essential. Many conversations will seem empty, many goals will seem childish, and many worries will seem absurd. But in return, you will gain a clarity that no distraction can offer. Philip Dick intuited that something was wrong with human comfort, suggesting that comfort is the anesthesia of imprisonment. Awakening requires you to be willing to feel the cold of emptiness. For it is in the cold of emptiness that you discover you are the source of warmth, and not a passive receiver of external light. The journey from here on is solitary, but it's the only one worth taking. You will begin to see other awakened observers in the most unlikely places. They recognize each other not by words, but by a certain kind of gaze, a gaze that cuts through the scenery and touches what is real. As Philip Dick already warned, resistance is not political or social, it is metaphysical. It is the refusal to be a functional component of a lie. Every time you choose observation instead of reaction, you weaken the black iron prison. Don't expect a happy ending or a magic solution to life's conflicts. Conflicts will continue, but they will no longer have the power to define who you are. You are the space where conflicts happen, not the conflict itself. Dick realized too early that freedom is not the absence of chains, but the recognition that chains are made of thought, and thoughts can be observed until they dissolve. False reality will continue trying to lull you back into sleep. It will use love, pain, and hope. But the observer now knows that these are just colored pixels on the screen of consciousness. I invite you now to act, not like an automaton, but like someone who recognizes the importance of this moment. Like this content if it provoked that necessary sense of unease, because every interaction helps to break the algorithm that tries to keep only noise at the top. Comment, even anonymously, on how your perception has changed in the last few minutes. Subscribe to continue this deconstruction process, because the journey out of the labyrinth requires guides who are not afraid of the darkness. Your engagement is not for the channel, it's to signal to the system that there is a demand for truth, not entertainment. Philip Dick sensed that the end was near, but the end is only the beginning of true reality. The world you knew is dying because you stopped feeding it with your unconditional belief. The observer has awakened, and he will no longer accept crumbs of fabricated meaning. You are on the edge of the map. The stage has ended. What comes next cannot be filmed, written, or programmed. It is the pure experience of being, unfiltered, unfiltered, and unfiltered. Remember, reality is what doesn't go away when you stop believing in it. What's left for you now that belief has been shaken? What remains when the noise fades? That's the only question that matters. And the answer isn't in these words, but in the quality of your attention at this very second. The false world is out there, screaming. The observer is in here, watching. And between the two, there is the freedom you've always had. But only now have you had the courage to notice. Go now and observe the cracks. They are everywhere. And through them, the light of what is real finally begins to enter. The automatic response is over. Perception is yours. The choice for the first time may truly be yours. Don't close the door you just opened. Strangeness is your new home. And the real is waiting for you on the other side of your next conscious breath.